Good morning, everybody. It's lovely to welcome you all here again this morning, either here in the hall with us or on Zoom. And this morning, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you once again, Dr. Robin Lee. After a successful career in academia and managing NGOs, Robin and his wife, Anina, moved to Hermanus in 2002. He was instrumental in setting up the U3A Overberg. He was the founding chairman and has been on the committee ever since for the duration of the society's life. He has spoken to U3A on many occasions and on many topics. Since 2012, he has been involved in the History Society as well and has been acting as the secretary. He's also an active member of the Whale Coast Conservation Group. Now, Robin has written many articles and published several books on the history of Hermanus. Today he's going to take us outside the bounds of the greater Hermanus area. And Robin, we really look forward to this next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Letitia. I hope that you'll all find this presentation interesting, and I hope that it's full of information for you as well. I just start by reinforcing what Letitia said, that I'm not on this occasion dealing with the greater Hermanus, as that has been dealt with in many other presentations and in many other books as well, but rather dealing with other human settlements in the Overstrand municipal area. This is the contents of the presentation this morning. I'll just say a little bit about the Overstrand local municipality, which is its correct title. Then what do we mean by human settlements? Something about the prehistoric settlements in the area, the San people and the Khoikhoi, then European settlement from 1700 up to now, and then deal with particular human settlements in their modern context. The Rooi-Els in Pringle Bay, Betty's Bay and Kleinmond, Hawston, Stanford and Gansbaai, and then some conclusions. So this is a map of the Overstrand municipal area. As you can see, it is of a bit rather odd shape. And as I'll make clear in a moment, there's a reason for this, as well as the way in which it moves along the coast. But as you can see, the settlements that I'll be referring to are all named on the map: Rooi-Els, Pringle Bay, Betty's Bay, Kleinmond, Hawston, then a bit inland to Stanford, and then back to the coast at Gansbaai. The municipality goes on a bit, but I haven't dealt with the much smaller human settlements that on the other side of Gansbaai. Now, the municipality was only created in 2000, so it's celebrating its 21st birthday sometime this year. It was established as part of a national revision of local government following the transition to democracy 6 years earlier. When it was formed, it incorporated several existing municipalities and some other forms of local government, such as village management boards. Its name came out of a competition that was held at the time and tries to combine two concepts: the traditional name associated with the mountains of the area, known in Afrikaans as Overberg and in English as the Overberg, and reference to the coastline, the Strand or Strand. Obviously, the name was preferred because it could be spelt in English and in Afrikaans in the same way. It's not a large municipality by national standards, only 1,700 square kilometers, but it is the municipality with the second longest coastline from False Bay to essentially Cape Agulhas. The population is estimated this year to be 109,000. Perhaps I need to say once and for all that all the population figures I give are estimates. There has not been a national census since 2011. There should have been one this year, but for obvious reasons to do with COVID, it has been postponed and no date has been set for it. So all population figures and any figures derived from them are estimates. It's growing at about 3.1% per annum, as estimated by the municipality itself. And the distribution is heavily weighted in favor of the greater Hermanus area, 61%, with a smaller percentage in the Stanford, Gansbaai, Agulhas area of 28%, and a much less population in the Pringle Bay, Rooi-Els, Betty's Bay and Kleinmond of only 11%. It's rated amongst the top 10 municipalities nationwide. So that is the area that we are speaking of, and that is the nature of that area in general, and the authority that is responsible for its administration. Now, turning to the prehistoric settlements in the Overstrand, there are a considerable number of these, some along the coastline and some a bit further inland. This is because all the settlements that existed in the late Stone Age were on the coastline, but the sea level has changed a couple of times over the long period since 70,000 years ago. And some of the caves are currently a few hundred meters inland. The inhabitants of these settlements were cave dwellers, and because the caves were almost always right on the coastline, they had a marine diet. Some anthropologists are even of the opinion that Homo sapiens might have originated in this area, although the majority view is that Homo sapiens originated in the East African area. But some maintain that the marine diet, which is well known for contributing to development of the brain, might have meant that they evolved here. They used sophisticated stone tools, which have been found in abundance in and around the caves along the coast and inland. And the very first indications of religious belief and perhaps artistic impulse can be shown from some of the material that has been found in the caves. For instance, there is a piece of ochre which has been sourced to the Blombos cave a little further up the coast, which date from 70,000 BC and appears to have markings on it which are either religious or artistic in nature. They also built extensive fish traps from which they maintained a portion of their diet. The other portion was shellfish, which they sourced from the rocks themselves. One of the most important caves in this area is the Klipgat cave near De Kelders, which has been excavated intensively in recent times and conclusively was inhabited about 70,000 years ago by the people that we have been discussing. The second, perhaps lesser known cave is the Klipkop cave on Khoikhoi, and not far from the hall in which we are meeting. And this is has also been dated in two different excavations as being approximately the same age. Stone tools and refuse have been found in both caves, which authenticates the fact that cave dwellers used those as long ago as 70,000 years. This is a representation of what a cave might have looked like at that time. You can see the cave dwellers involved in various occupations. They had access to fire, of course, and cooked their food. They killed animals, partly for food, but also for use as clothing. You can see in the bottom right-hand corner that they are eating some kind of shellfish, probably oysters, and a hunter is bringing in a buck which had been killed in the interior of the coastline in question. Those cave dwellers disappeared about 50,000 years ago, and there's a long period of time which is not very specifically identified in terms of population. But about 20,000 years ago, the San people first appeared in this area. They, of course, are very much better known to us than the late Stone Age, because the San survived in small groups into the modern era. These were hunter-gatherers, lived in small groups, and their temporary settlements that they put up were based on access to food and to water supplies. But they did use the caves that had been previously inhabited by the Stone Age populations, and their deposits can be found on top of the Stone Age dwellers. By about 2,000 years ago, were supplanted by the Khoikhoi people, who were originally called by the Europeans the Hottentots, and have recently had a variety of names, but that appears to be the most recent version of their own language of the name, Khoikhoi. These were a semi-nomadic people. Their society was based on a clan system, that each tribe was divided into various clans, and each clan had a headman. They did not use the caves. They were cattle-based culture, and obviously were much more at home in the interior than they were on the coastline. The major settlement in this area, which is now the Overstrand Municipality, was in the vicinity of Caledon, where they might be said to have had their headquarters as regards the Overberg. But there was a substantial settlement at the Bot River estuary. This was where they first came into contact with Europeans. These Europeans were shipwreck victims. Many European ships rounding the Cape and making their way to the Indies wrecked in and around Gullis, and the shipwrecked victims tried to make their way to the Cape along the coast. There they met up with the Khoikhoi people, and particularly the headman of the settlement at the Bot River estuary. He has come down through history to us by the name that the Dutch officials gave him, Klaas, but obviously that was not his initial or real name. He treated the shipwreck victims very well, and there were good relationships between the Dutch East India Company officials and this particular clan of the Khoikhoi. They also traded with farmers when farmers crossed the Hottentot Holland Mountains and reached the Overberg. And as we all know from history, conflicts over the ownership of cattle and access to land began almost immediately and continued right through the late 17th and into the 18th centuries. However, the particular tribal structure in the Overberg area was decimated by smallpox epidemics, the first in 1687 and the second in 1713. The Khoikhoi, of course, had no immunity to smallpox, and the population was virtually wiped out. Those that were left either integrated with the remaining San tribes, or they drifted into the employ of farmers, and in the longer run into the European settlements that were created in that area. So between 20,000 BC and around about the time that the first Europeans arrived, the San and the Khoikhoi people dominated structures in this area. I have some illustrations. Here is a photograph of a museum exhibit of San cave dwellers. It's essentially similar to the later Stone Age dwellers, but of course they would have had more sophisticated tools. Through their contact with Bantu-speaking people, the San had access to iron implements, and especially arrowheads, and obviously hunted game. But they also used to a considerable extent a marine diet, and from that we have the famous strandlopers, or sand dwellers who lived by preference along the coast and came down to modern times. Bientang's cave in Hermanus, for instance, is reputed to have been the home of the last strandloper, or sand dweller, in that cave. This is a more usual photograph of sand people, inland, of course, no longer adjacent to the coast, and employing their traditional methods as they moved about as hunter-gatherers. We know that the San were here because they left paintings on the walls of some of the caves. And here is an authentic painting dating from several thousand years ago at Philipskop, not far from Stanford in this area. The Khoikhoi were much more nomadic and moved with their possessions. This rather idealized picture of a Khoikhoi clan traveling comes down to us from the 19th century, showing the use of animals for transporting their goods, and also the small construction of small huts covered with little mats, which they employed for shelter. At Genadendal, there is a project in which the reconstruction of Khoikhoi mats, shelters through mats, has been demonstrated and is available for modern people to see. By about the late 1600s and early 1700s, Europeans were beginning to penetrate these areas. The first people at all that came here were people who came on exploration trips on their own initiative usually, though sometimes funded by the Dutch East India Company, and also naturalists who saw the amazing vegetation that was to be seen over the mountains and came here to look at it, to collect samples, and to begin the naming process of the fynbos vegetation. So conservation goes back to the very earliest trips of Europeans into this area. Officials of the Dutch East India Company came here on specific tasks to do with the administration of the area or to help rescue people who had been shipwrecked. But by far the most important impact of European settlement was through farmers who moved out of the Cape to get away from the administration of the Dutch East India Company. And it's important to notice that the Dutch East India Company tried to contain this movement out from Cape Town. They kept moving the border further east, and farmers kept crossing the border and going into lands which were not yet even claimed by the company. The company evolved a particular land tenure system, which is very important in future history of settlement in the Overstrand. The Dutch East India Company regarded all land along the coast and in the interior as belonging to the company. They did not recognize any local indigenous ownership of land, and they did not allow any of the farmers to become outright owners of the land. The company retained ownership of the land and rented it, or granted it, as it often says in the documents, to a particular farmer by name who had grazing rights only on that farm. In fact, in the early parts of the 18th century, the farmers were not even allowed to erect dwellings on the land and could only graze their cattle on it. This was part of the Dutch East India Company's attempt to prevent the spread of the farmers into the interior. This system came down to the British in 1795 when they occupied the Cape, and again when they returned in 1803 and 1806, they adopted this system. The British called the land Crown land, that is, it belonged to the Crown, to the reigning monarch, Queen Victoria, in fact. But they still did not grant ownership of the land to the farmers on it until well into the 19th century. And a lot of the early settlements in the Overstrand were made possible by the fact that the land was seen to belong to the Crown, to the government, and therefore could easily be made available for people to set up villages and towns on it without having to deal with the farmer. Along the coast, a group of people of quite importance to Hermanus, known as Trosters, also penetrated. Perhaps that is best translated into English as brigands or robbers. They were a mix of slaves, escaped slaves, freed slaves after 1833, convicts who had jumped ship in Cape, members of the British military who had absconded from their duties and moved into the interior to escape from further prosecution. And they also inhabited sites along the coast and generally lived by preying on farmers and other travelers and the local indigenous inhabitants. And then fisher folk moved by boat along the sea and settled at point to point. So the Europeans came along this coast in a variety of manners and penetrated into the interior in a variety of ways. So now we come to the actual settlements themselves. Rooi-Els, as you see, was founded on a farm initially known as Welgemoed, granted to a family, Grovier, in 1729. Later, the name of the farm was changed to Weigaard, and part of it was granted to the Lowe family, who renamed it Rooi-Els. At that point in time, the 1840s to 1860s, the farm was only accessible by sea or by going over Sir Lowry's Pass and then round through Bot River, across the Pulmead River and back, travelling south to the farm. In 1900, some plots were surveyed on the farm and put on the market at £600. Only a few sold. And even in the period 1900 to 1940, only a few more plots were sold. So there was a very small population there when the Second World War broke out in 1939. But in 1942, the government, the Union of South Africa government, built a military road to give greater access to this area from Gordons Bay. And that, of course, changed the course of development at Rooi-Els considerably. Nevertheless, even as late as 1967, the census showed that there were only 15 permanent residents. In 1970, the first shop opened. 1972, the Rooi-Els Ratepayers Association was established. In 1980, there were 200 dwellings, but only 40% of them permanently occupied. This had only increased by 6 in the 21 years to 2001, but 50% of the houses now had permanent residents. This year or last year, the population was estimated to be only 300. What occurred here is that the people who settled there did so because it was relatively inaccessible, and also because they wished to retain the rural atmosphere of the little village, and became very conservation minded. And that's played a very important role in limiting the size of Rooi-Els and also determining the kind of development that took place there. This is an image of modern Rooi-Els with the road swinging around at the base of the little village and moving away up Clarence Drive to Gordon's Bay. As you can see, it's still a very sparsely settled area, and the nature of the housing is relatively simple and quite consistent with the rural atmosphere which the inhabitants have tried to maintain. Pringle Bay has a somewhat similar history. It was identified as early as 1796 by the Royal Navy, who named the bay for their admiral, Admiral Sir Thomas Pringle, who was in charge of the British Navy at the bay, at Cape Table Bay, when they occupied the Cape in 1795. The farm adjacent to the bay was granted to the Lowe family and named Khoikhoi, and virtually no development took place there at all until the 1930s, when the farm was sold to the Walsh brothers. They intended to put some plots there and surveyed them and put them on the market, but again there was no demand because access was extremely difficult. Nevertheless, in 1936, the village was actually named and recognized, given a village management board by the provincial government. And then, for the same reason as Rooi-Els, development started when the military road was built in 1942, and a radar station was built on Cape Hunklip. I'll return to that in a moment. By 1980, it was still a tiny settlement of 100 houses, half of which were holiday homes. The inhabitants of Pringle Bay did not ask for electricity. In fact, they resisted the application of electricity until 1992. And in the 1990s, they were very much involved with people from Betty's Bay in creating the Overberg Biosphere Reserve, indicating again a strong commitment to conservation. In 2020, the population is estimated to be about 1,000. Here is an aerial survey, an aerial view of Pringle Bay. Again, as you see, not heavily or densely settled, many empty plots even now, with Cape Hunklip in the background and moving around to behind Cape Hunklip. This is the beach at Pringle Bay. The harbour was never developed by the British, although it was found by the Navy and named by the Navy. It proved to be completely inapplicable and unusable as an harbour. But the key factor in the development of Pringle Bay was the radar station. In the early 1940s, the British invented radar and saw that it would be a very important element of their capabilities during the Second World War. They asked Premier Jan Smuts to identify a person to whom they could convey knowledge about radar, and he identified Basil Schonland. Of course, he was then simply a very young professor at Wits University in the geophysics department, and he was given a task of developing radar along the South African coast. Eventually, 15 radar stations were built along the coast, 13 of which were in the Cape province, as it then was. One of these was at Cape Hunklip, and the radar station buildings still stand there up against the mountain and can be visited if you want to undertake the rather sharp walk up to them. The little building to the left is the building in which the plotting of the movement of ships was undertaken, and the taller building on the right would have had the radar tower above it, picking up the signals reflected back from shipping passing and submarines on the coast. Obviously, people were stationed there to operate the radar, and barracks were built for the staff in Betty's Bay. These are the barracks in their present condition. They are part of a youth camp site run by the Dutch Reformed Church for mainly coloured youth, called Mooihavens, and they are substantially the barracks operated by the Union Defence Force during the Second World War, renovated, of course, to a certain degree. Betty's Bay was also developed on a portion of the farm Weegaard, and unlike all the other settlements I'm talking about, it never developed a village centre. It was always developed as a residential township only, and it spreads 8 kilometres along the coast. Again, it's on a farm that was owned at the turn of the 20th century by the Walsh brothers, who simply held it as undeveloped land, hoping that it would increase in value without their having to spend anything on it. In 1912, they leased a portion of it to Captain Frank Cook for a whaling station, and I'll speak about that in a few minutes. In 1935, the Walsh brothers sold the land to Huncliffe Estates Limited, who did intend to develop a township. The syndicate behind Huncliffe Estates was Jack Clarence, Harold Porter, and Jack Yulden, and their names remain in use in the area. Jack Yulden's daughter Betty is the person named in Betty's Bay. Jack Clarence, who rebuilt Clarence Drive, is commemorated in the name Clarence Drive, and Harold Porter donated his farm to the state for the Harold Porter Botanical Gardens. There was a slow development of the township, mainly for holiday homes during the 50s and 60s, and from about 1960s onwards, development did improve, but the residents remained involved in nature conservation. In 1973, the first organization formed in Betty's Bay was the Wildflower Association. They also did not agree to receive electricity until 1992. And in the 1990s, they were involved in the Khoikhoi biosphere formation. Here's an aerial view of Betty's Bay. As you can see, it's again a very sparsely inhabited area even now. The road through it, of course, has been vastly improved in the last couple of years. But the town is still primarily rural in nature and conservation-minded on the part of the people who live there. The Harold Porter Botanical Gardens is well worth a visit. It's the site of Harold Porter's own section of the township. As far as the whaling station is concerned, it operated there from about 1915 to 1930. It was a fully fledged whaling station, as you can see from this drawing made at the time, but with the use of the various buildings put in as captions later. But you'll see there were employees' quarters, there were huts for the non-white employees, there was a guano factory, a meat house, and an oil settling tanks were all built there. And it employed at its height in the early 1920s about 200 people. This is the site as it looks at present. You can see where the guano factory used to be, where the meat house, blubber house and so on used to be. And it hasn't been redeveloped in any way at all over the years, and can be visited, and you can see very clearly as you walk around the nature of the whaling station as it would have been all those years ago. This is a photograph taken in the late 1920s, I think. There's no date on the photograph, but just looking at the type of equipment used, which is probably one of the largest, if not the largest whale that they captured and killed at Stony Point. As you can see, a considerable number of employees can stand on and next to the whale without obscuring it in any way at all. And it's quite a sophisticated operation, as you can see from the tanks and other buildings behind. This is how it looks now if you stand at Stony Point and look out to sea, and the remains of one of the whalers, a whaling boat called Una, can be seen in the middle of the picture. And when the Stony Point whaling station was eventually closed in 1925, they sank the whaling boat there, and it has been gradually rotting away ever since. Moving on to Kleinmond. Kleinmond was developed on two farms, a portion of the same farm as all the other settlements, Khoikhoi, and a farm called Lamloch. By 1853, there was a harbour and a small fishing settlement there, but it had no particular name, as far as I can make out, until in 1860, the Reverend Albertine, who served the congregation at Port River, built a holiday home there, and he was later joined by many other dominees, and particular Dutch Reformed religious influence has been important in the settlement ever since. In 1908, there were some sites surveyed at the western end of Kleinmond, and then a couple of years later at the eastern end on the farm Lamloch. And then in 1917, a holiday resort known as Kleinmond Strand was developed there and much patronized by members of the Dutch Reformed Church. In 1948, it became an official town with its own council. In 1950, there were 1,000 houses there, and the population was about 2,700. 1959, it became a municipality of its own and remained so until it subsumed into the Overstrand Municipality in 2000. In 1916, there was a major upheaval in the town when the Group Areas Acts were applied, and the coloured population who had been living mainly near the harbour and participating in the fishing trade were moved out of there and relocated in the township up on the mountainside. Last year, the population was estimated at about 9,000. This is a view of the more recent development of Kleinmond, looking across the lagoon, which is really part of the Port River estuary. This is the Kleinmond harbour, around which the original settlement grew up, supported economically by fishing. And from this area, the people were removed under the Group Areas Acts to the township. And the most famous tourist attraction, perhaps, of Kleinmond are the wild horses that live on the Port River estuary, and there are many legends about their origin. Moving on across the Port River and passing Fisherhaven to reaching Hawston, Hawston was developed on a farm called Afdagsrivier, which first comes into history in 1750 when it was granted to the Gillemere family. The original name, which was not Hawston, was Gansbaai, which arose because a Swedish sailor, Harry Cruz, settled there when in his retirement, and his name was pronounced by the locals who spoke a version of Afrikaans of course, spoken as Heri. So Harry became Heri, and the area became Herisbaai. In 1830, some farmers' plots were surveyed, and the name chosen was Middelvlei. In 1840, a black American named Samuel Dyer, who had been living on what we now know as Dyer's Island off Kleinmond near Gansbaai, moved from that area. Well, he sold the island which he occupied, Dyer Island, to the government, and in exchange they gave him plots in Middelvlei. In 1860, the town was laid out officially as Middelvlei, but then shortly afterwards, in about 1862, it was renamed after a local official called Charles Hall, Hawston. He administered Hawston from Caledon. And from the start, the population of Hawston was mixed ethnically and by social class. Considerable number of fairly well-off people, middle-class people, and very poor people lived there. Coloureds and Indians and a small number of black Africans also lived there side by side until the 1960s. The land was sold under what was called Queen Victoria's law, in terms of which the official, Mr. Hall, granted you certain land, and if you paid rental on that for 30 years, you became the owner of the land. And this form of quit rent or rental leasehold persisted in Hawston up until modern times. By 1925, another 50 sites had been laid out, and by 1937, a housing scheme creating further housing was developed there. But all of this time, Hawston remained administered from Caledon. It was not subsumed into Hermanus until after the 1960s. As part of the Group Areas Act, Hawston was proclaimed as a coloured area and part of Greater Hermanus. Its present population is estimated at about 12,000. This is on the left, Mr. Hall himself. He actually had a holiday home known as Plankhuis in Hawston and spent all his holidays there, as well as administering it from Caledon. Painting by Pieter Johan Nordier of the early types of houses that were found in Hawston. And this is a modern shot of Hawston's harbour, which is the precise location of Herisbaai. Now, Herisbaai is important in the history of Hermanus because it was from this particular bay that 5 families set out in 1857, sailed around the headland we know as around the adjacent headland and into the inlet, which they called the Visbaai, and which later became Hermanus. These are some historical shots from the famous work by Professor Franssen of the villages and towns of the Old Cape, of the types of houses that were found in Hawston until very recent times. I myself personally, arriving here after the year 2000, have seen some of the old parlourhuise, which have since been demolished. Now we move on across the Klein River to Stanford. Again, started as a farm, in this case the farm Kleinrivier Vallei, which was granted to Christoffel Brandt in 1769. He sold it to Sir John Truter, who in turn sold it to Sir Robert Stanford. There's a very sad story attached to Robert Stanford, which I will tell you in a moment, but just continuing with the history of the settlement, in 1856, the farm was sold to Philippus de Bruyn, and he was the person who laid out the town of Stanford. Now, by this time, farmers had freehold ownership of land. So of all the settlements we're talking about today, The one which was developed as a commercial venture for profit by the farm owner is Stanford. He laid out 165 plots in a rectangular grid pattern and laid on water from a stream known as the Oog to 97 of them. Others had waterfront properties along the Klein River. The government immediately granted status to the farm, to the Stanford village, and a village management board took over the running of it. In 1919, it was converted to a municipality, and it developed slowly but surely. So by 1950, there were about 800 residents living there, mostly permanently, with some holiday homes. Like a couple of other places in the area, it suffered the impact of the imposition of the Group Areas Acts in the 1960s, and a separate residential area for coloured residents, known as the schema, or in English, the scheme, presumably the township scheme or the housing scheme, was set up and created the basic segregated nature of Stanford, which persists till today. 1995, the population had reached 1,800, and by 2000, it increased very sharply. Stanford became quite popular as a holiday home destination. In the 2000s, the town has been distinguished by a strong conservation movement, a very sharp increase in holiday homes, and a very active conservation foundation or trust, which makes sure that any new structures conform to the nature of the Victorian development of Stanford as a town. This is the modern part of Stanford along the Klein River, which winds its way down on the left towards the sea. And the town itself is on the left-hand side and just outside this particular image. This is the Anglican Church. The original town set aside land from the start for an Anglican church and a Dutch Reformed church, and both of these have endured since the beginning of the settlement itself, although the Dutch Reformed church is a more modern building than this particular Anglican church. As you can see from the sign on the church, that photograph was taken to commemorate 150 years, from 1863, which would be 5 years after the establishment of Stanford, until 2013. This is on the left-hand side of this slide, is the actual advertisement for the sale of the proposed village of Stanford. The number of sites is given, the nature of the sites, what land will be set aside for schools and other public facilities, and the way in which people can go to the auction and buy a plot in Stanford. And as you can see, it's dated Caledon, April the 7th, 1856. Sir Robert Stanford, after whom is named, has a very tragic history. He was a military man, a major in the British Army in India. And when on his way home from his service in India, he stopped at the Cape. He very much liked the area and he decided to settle here. He was a successful farmer, but in order to become a farmer and to devote himself to farming, he went on to a system prevalent in the British Army at that time called half pay. This meant that you could involve yourself in your own personal activities while remaining a member of the military, but on half pay. However, it did mean that in an emergency, you could be called up for military service without having any say in the matter, as you were still regarded as having been a member of the military service for the entire time. And this was the downfall of Sir Robert. In the 1850s, the British government decided to start sending convicts to the Cape instead of exclusively to Australia, as they had been doing for decades. Of course, this annoyed and amazed the inhabitants of Cape Town, and they resisted the landing of the first convict ship, the HMS Neptune, in Cape Town. They also boycotted supplying food and water and any other materials to the military government. Sir Harry Smith was the governor of the Cape at the time, and he was unable to provide for the maintenance of the convicts on the ship when it docked in Cape Town Harbour, because the entire population was boycotting the supply of goods and the payment of taxes and many other ways. Then Sir Harry had the bright idea that Sir Robert Stanford was still technically a member of the military and thus could be ordered to do something. And Sir Harry Smith ordered him to supply from his farms, including the farm at Stanford, water and food to the convict ship and to the government soldiers who had previously been without. Sir Robert had to do this as it was a military order. This meant that he fell foul of the inhabitants of Cape Town, and he himself was then put on boycott. His children were thrown out of schools. Medical doctors would not see him and his family. One of his daughters died for lack of medical care, and people would raided his farm and failed to pay him for items which he delivered to them, invaded other farms on which he was trying to make a living, until eventually he was forced to go to England to try to correct the situation. And while he was away, his property was vandalized, and in effect, the property of the farm itself was removed from him by illegal means while he was overseas trying to get the government to address this issue. As a result of this hostility and the way in which his family was negatively affected, his health failed, and although he continued until the end of his life trying to recover Stanford and his other farms, Kleinmond as a farm, and his other farms, he eventually died penniless in a house in Manchester. And the History Society has on file a copy of his death certificate, which shows him as Robert Stanford, Knight, and his death in Manchester at the age of 70, completely penniless, having been destroyed by the fact that he was the wrong person in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now finally, Gansbaai. This is established on the farm Strandfontein. The first mention of it appears on a bay as on a map as Hydra's Bay, but no settlement. A fisherman known as Tutoy repeated very promising fishing conditions off the coast. Johannes Wessels was the first inhabitant of Gansbaai who moved there. The little settlement was initially known as Gansgat, but later changed to Gansbaai. By 1903, about 17 fishermen were operating in the area, and by 1906, sufficient families had moved there, living in small cottages to establish a school. Japie de Villiers, a man named Japie de Villiers, bought the farm, and he laid out the first formal plots as holiday accommodation at what we know as De Kelders. In 1919, a man named Johannes Barnard took up position as the first principal of the Gansbaai High School, and in 1924, there was the first official survey and sale of plots. By 1932, a village management board had been established, and in 1939, a factory was established in the harbour for processing sharks' livers. There was an enormous demand for these in World War II for the vitamin D supplement that was required by the population of the United Kingdom. 1945, Paul Zitzman appointed as a school principal. Now, I mention these two, which you would not normally associate with township development, because both of them became mayors of Gansbaai, and both of them played active roles in the development of the town. In the 1950s, Zitzman developed a fishermen's cooperative known as Gansbaai Fishing Corporation, and he became a well-known figure in the National Party in the 1950s. Also, Eric Lowe, who became foreign minister in the nationalist government after 1948, was the local MP, and he saw to it that considerable funds flowed from the government to Gansbaai for the development of the harbour and of the fishing industry. As early as 1963, a large fish meal factory was built there, and considerable government investment flowed throughout the 60s and 70s. By 1970, the population was 1,600. The municipal area grew larger by incorporation of smaller villages. The population by 1990 had risen to 2,400. In 1992, the municipal area was further enlarged. 2000, it became part of the Overstrand Municipality, and in 2020, the population is estimated at 20,000. On the left is a very early diagram of Gansbaai, with still the name Gansgat, as you can see, number 2 there, the harbour itself, and just a few houses, so few houses, in fact, that the individual nicknames of the people who inhabit the houses appear on the map, Troiki. Early cottage of Gansbaai on the right-hand side, that's the sort that the early fishermen erected there. Of course, its development in recent times has been quite spectacular, and it's now a fully fledged town in its own right, with a modern harbour and a much more developed fishing industry than Hermanus itself was able to maintain. So what conclusions can you reach? Well, first of all, and this was important, all the settlements started on farmland, and the form of ownership of farmland made it easier for settlements to be started. Some of the settlements have essentially gone on through rural and conservation ethics, trying to preserve the rural nature of the land itself. Kleinmond is the only one of the settlements where you can detect a religious ethic at work in the establishment of the town, but it is not a church village in the sense that Franson, for instance, uses the term. A church village would be, for instance, such as Elam or Genadendal, where the church actually is the basis of the village development. In Kleinmond, the village developed privately, but with a strong Dutch Reformed influence. Hawston is the only one which had a multiracial origin. There were mixed settlements within Greater Hermanus, but Hawston specifically as a multiracial place from its origins in the 19th century up until the Group Areas Acts in the 1960s. And for all of the settlements that I've mentioned, the primary economic basis for the moment is tourism. And obviously the impact of COVID on these towns has been quite significant. I hope that gives you an overview of some of the dominant settlements in this area, in the Overstrand, which you can use to complement understandings you may have of the somewhat different development which took place in the Greater Hermanus area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. I actually want to ask you a question. Do you know anything about Bart Skeerder's Bos with a strange name? Do you know what the origin of the name is?
I know what the dominant explanation is that there is a kind of insect which is reputed to have the ability to use its claws to cut little hairs growing on people's faces and on their hands. And that the colloquial name for that kind of, I think it's a kind of scorpion, is a baardskierder. And they were to be found in abundance in the woods around what is now Baardskierdersbos. That's the dominant explanation. It's based on that particular insect. There was one comment that has reached me via the chat box, and that is to emphasize the importance of the point I made at the beginning about population. The point made by David Carter is that without accurate population statistics, accurate planning cannot take place. You cannot plan the development of any area, more specifically an urban area, if you don't know the number of people living there and you don't have sound projections of the number of people who will be living there in the future. And so the postponement of the 2021 census is obviously overshadowed in the headlines by COVID and all sorts of other issues. But the postponement could have a very negative effect on the ability of our municipalities to plan for the future with any accuracy. And I'd just like to add, I didn't say it at the time, but most municipalities are now doing their kind of ad hoc planning. They conduct surveys of portions of a place. And on the basis of that survey, they project how the population has grown since the census in 2011. And then on those projections, they further project how it will grow in time to come. Now you're building projections on projections and not on fact. And they could be wildly wrong. So, when I say that the area of the Overstrand, the population has grown by 3.1%, I personally think that's probably an considerable underestimate. But there's no way of proving yes or no to it. The point that is made is that without a proper census, you cannot do proper planning.
One thing we might also mention, the area of Elim, which is settled by the Moravian Church. We had a lecture on the Moravian Church and the development in South Africa a while ago. So Elim also falls within the Overstrand area. And maybe people who are interested in its history can refer to the recording of that talk about the Moravian Church.
Yeah, and of course, closer to home, but still obviously within the Overstrand, is the influence on the leper colony in the Hermanus Valley. I was lucky to recently visit the Hermanus Valley and to the farm now known as Volmut, which is now a religious establishment. And they have very recently identified what is most likely the graveyard, the burial place of the people who perished as lepers in the Hermanus Valley. It was heavily overgrown with aliens, and it required a considerable expenditure on the part of the religious community and a considerable amount of physical effort by a large number of people to clear the site. But I was privileged to walk there, and there's no doubt that there are stone cairns and stone markings which are indisputably those of a graveyard of the 19th century. And the area they've cleared contains 22 graves. So you immediately say to yourself, that's not a family graveyard. In any event, most farming families, Afrikaans-speaking farming families, took care of their grave sites. They wouldn't let them become overgrown by aliens. So for those two reasons, the number of graves and the fact that it was allowed to go to waste indicates that this is probably where the poor leper people who died in the colony there are buried. And they're busy clearing. It looks as if they may eventually end up with 40 or 50 graves. That indicates you're not here dealing with a family graveyard. You're dealing with the burial site of a significant community.
The Kelders area adjacent to Gansbaai, does that have a separate development history, or is it just a part of an extension of Gansbaai?
It has a separate development because I mentioned it perhaps too briefly in the talk. The original structures erected on that farm for habitation by people other than the family were erected on the cliffs at De Kelders by a man named De Villiers. Japie, he has this delightful name, Japie Pop Jaap De Villiers. And he built a string of cottages which struck the local inhabitants as looking like a train. And so and people could rent a room essentially in this string of cottages. And so it was referred to as die train. And this was the first holiday accommodation in that area. And that was at De Kelders. And the attraction there, obviously the whales had not returned. It was long before the southern right whales returned. And so the main attraction there was the caves. And people went for holidays there specifically to explore the caves, hoping to, get away with a stalactite or stalagmite or something under their coat. And they went swimming in little rivers in the caves. There were actual little dams made in the caves where you could swim. I have actually done it in the 1970s in the large Dipkelder at De Kelders. So De Kelders predates Gansbaai by perhaps 2 decades. But once Gansbaai took off as an industrial fishing village, then they went different ways. De Kelders remained an exclusively residential area. Gradually the caves were blocked up and people were denied access, and they were professionally excavated and so on. But De Kelders then developed as basically a town based on the economy of fishing. And that's an interesting contrast to Hermanus, because Hermanus, because the harbour could not be developed extensively, never got an industrial fishing base. The new harbour was intended to be the industrial fishing base of Hermanus. But by the time it was developed in the 1950s, the supply of fish in Walker Bay had declined to a level which was no longer economic. You had to go out to sea. And so although the Gansbaai trawlers are based in Gansbaai, they're ocean-going trawlers. They're not trawlers that fish in Walker Bay. And they even go up the west coast for snook. So the development of Gansbaai was exclusively economic, and the economy was fishing. And De Kelders was exclusively residential, and the economy was tourism. And they just went different ways. So, but they are obviously now part of the Overstrand.
So Hermanus reverted to tourism as its main economic base.
It got there because fishing couldn't be sustained. And eventually, fish stock in Walker Bay declined to a point where even angling was no longer feasible. While you had a fishing small-scale industry going out of the old harbour, people with money mainly came to Hermanus to catch fish by line off the rocks and to stay at the hotels. And that's how the hotel industry started. And so angling, as distinct from fishing, are very different activities. Angling is middle class, fishing is working class. Angling is holidays, fishing is every day. And so Hermanus went the angling, tourism, hotel economy route, and Gansbaai went the fishing from boats, trawlers, deep sea fishing, ocean fishing route. From where one is in Hermanus on the other side of Gansbaai towards Agulhas, has its own name. It's no longer Fynbos, it's Stuntveld. a particular kind of vegetation which is grown on the dunes which were there. And it has a history all of its own. But there's a very interesting museum at Franskraal called the Strandveld Museum, which is well worth anyone's visit.
I have been sitting here enthralled. Robin, thank you once again for a superb presentation. What an interesting, fascinating history our region has. And thank you for bringing it to life for us. And now when we travel around, we know a little bit more of interest. Thank you for prickling our interest and supplying us with these fascinating stories. What an interesting region we live in. Thank you for bringing it to life for us, and good luck with your future research, because we like to hear all about it. Thank you, Robin.
Thank you.